Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, we are going to learn about the Ponziani opening. We are going to have a look at numerous variations. Moreover, highly there's a possibility that you can win a game in just 8 moves. So, let's get started. It starts with e4, black responds with e5, knight f3, knight c6, and the most common move from white here is to play the bishop to c4. We have seen this Italian game in our last videos. The Ponziani starts with pawn to c3. Now the idea behind pawn c3 is to play the pawn to d4 and take the control in the center. Here in this video, we are going to have a look at all the responses what black is going to do. The most common move here what black player does is to play the knight to f6. They also play the pawn to d6 or bishop c5. These are also the normal responses that black do. But let's first start with knight to f6. After knight f6, now we can go ahead with our plan and attack in the center, play a pawn to d4. Now because these pawns are strong and you are giving some more pressure on the e5 pawn, it is likely that the black player will capture your pawn on the d4 square. And once they do that, you don't immediately recapture it. Instead, you do an intermediate move. You first give an attack to the knight by pushing your pawn to e5. We kind of want to annoy our opponent. Attack the knight. Now there's only one good square as of now for the knight to go. The knight don't want to go back, and if it goes on the g4 square, you are going to attack and push it back. So the good square and the most common response again from black is to play the knight to d5. After this, now you don't immediately recapture on the d4 square again. Instead, you give an attack to the knight. You play a bishop to c4. Now where is this knight supposed to go? If it goes back on the e7 square, then the bishop will be blocked. Can't go back to the f6 square. So only good square possible for the knight to go is to go back on the b6 square, attacking our knight. Now here, white has two interesting choices. One is to just capture on the f7 square with the bishop, which is shocking, surprising, yet interesting. And the other one is to simply play solid and come back on the b3 square. Let's first see what happens when we capture on the f7 square with the bishop. It is a check. If the king doesn't capture the bishop and comes up, then this is going to lose the queen. So it is kind of forced for the king to capture the bishop on the f7 square. Once the king captures the bishop on the f7 square, now you blow in another check. You just play a knight to g5, giving a check. Here there are various options what black can do. The most common responses that the engine suggests is to either go king g8 or to go with the king to e8. Let's first see what happens when the king goes to g8 square. He falls himself into a trap. If he goes on the g8 square, then you come up with a mind-blowing attack. You play your queen to b3, give a check. And this is going to be a checkmate in just next two moves. Here the only way to defend is to play the pawn to d5, and you can finish the game in style by doing an opossa. You can capture on the d6 square and it's a check. He can give away a few of his minor pieces, but that doesn't help because it is going to be a checkmate any which ways. Right? Okay, now let's coming back and see what if after knight g5 check, he's not going on the g8 square. Instead, the king goes back on the e8 square. If the king goes back on e8 square, you can continue the attack in various ways. Here you are a piece down, but practically white is in a much better position when compared to black. Here what I suggest you is to castle. Simply protect your king in the center. Also, his king is now stuck in the center. Can't go anywhere. So you get your king into safety and just castle. Next, if he captures your pawn on the c3 square, then you can capture it with your knight and you are doing good positionally. If he places bishop to e7, trying to give an attack to your knight, don't come back with the knight. He might think that your knight is the most active piece and a potential attacker for black, right? So you don't get back the knight. Instead, you just defend it. How do we defend it? The bishop is already protecting it. Bring one more defender. Just play a pawn to h4. If he capture, you can capture it back with the bishop and attack the queen. The queen will have no good square to go to and the knight will have to block it. Then queen f3 comes in and you are having a fabulous attack there. But what if he thinks that let me kick out the knight again by putting some more pressure and playing the pawn to h6? Well, that's a big blunder. It's a disaster for black because after h6, now you can go with your queen to h5 and give a check. He cannot block the check with the pawn on g6 square because then you are going to capture it and it is going to be a checkmate eventually. If he moves his king to f8, still queen f7 will be a checkmate. So any which ways he plays a pawn to h6, which is kind of tempting, it results into a checkmate. So this was all when we have seen we are doing bishop to f7 move. Let's say you want to play solid. It is interesting and risky at the same time. May not give you a result immediately. So some players might not want to go for bishop f7. What can we do there? The bishop is under attack. We can go with our bishop to b3 and protect it. Now, if he captures on the c3 square with his pawn, then you capture it back with the knight, getting a free tempo. He can now pin your knight with his bishop on b4 square, so you unpin it by simply castling. Let's say he also castle, and now you can just play on knight to g5, putting some more pressure on the f7 square. Now, what's the idea behind knight g5 is to also play the queen to h5 and attack over here. Let's say he tries to give you an attack by playing his pawn to h6, but that doesn't stop us from going queen h5. We are going to sacrifice our knight and just play our queen to h5. If here the opponent gets greedy and captures your free knight on the g5 square, then this is a simple, solid yet a killer move. Play your knight to e4. Now, idea behind knight f4 is simple. You want to replace the knight on g5 with this knight. Now here either he will have to lose the queen or he will have to lose the game. Let's say, how can he defend this? He cannot play the pawn to f6 because this is already a pin. And let's say if he plays his pawn to g6 trying to kick off your queen, well, that is again a blunder because you can simply capture the pawn on the g6 square. He cannot recapture it and it's a pin. The check, you go with the queen to h6, give a check, king goes here, you give a check, it is not a checkmate, the queen can capture the knight and now you can recapture it with your pawn and it is going to be a checkmate on the next move eventually. Okay, so this was all when the opponent was doing a most common response from black, playing the knight to f6. Now let's have a look at the other variation. What if he is not playing his knight to f6, instead he is playing his bishop to c5. Now that also doesn't stop us from playing our pawn to d4, attack the bishop, attack the pawn. We can play our pawn to d4, he capture, we capture it back and the bishop can go back or the bishop can come to b4. Okay. But interesting is to capture on the e5 square with the knight. That gives away the knight temporarily, but we can recapture it anytime. Now you can give a double attack, play a pawn to d4. If he captures it with the bishop, then you can capture it back with the pawn and look at your two pawns, such a solid position in the center. And what if he's not capturing and is doing the correct response by going the bishop back on the d6 square? You capture the knight, the bishop captures it back and you attack the bishop further. How do we do that? We play our pawn to f4, aggressive pawn f4. Now look at these pawns, they are so strong in the center. He goes back, you can anytime push it forward. Let's say the bishop goes back on the d6 square. Now here, instead of immediately pushing your pawn on the e5 square, what instead you do is you first play your bishop to e3. Now what is the idea behind bishop e3 is you are controlling the c5 square. If you would have directly played your pawn to e5, then the bishop would have come to c5 and then he is attacking on this diagonal. We don't want that to happen. So you first play your pawn, bishop to e3, he plays this, and if he does a mistake by playing his knight to f6, then you can just push your pawn to e5, a double attack, and you win a piece on spot. So bishop c5 has a disadvantage of capturing directly on the e5 square. Now let's see the other common variation what the opponent would do. If he is smart and he knows that d4 is a threat, let me not play my bishop to c5. Knight f6 is also resulting into a Ponziani trap, the classical trap. Then what can we do? We can play a pawn to d6. Go simple. Pawn d6, you still attack in the center, you play a pawn to d4. He capture, you capture it back and you have two pawns in the center. The idea is again to push your pawn to d5. Before pushing the pawn to d5, you can first pin this knight and take advantage of the pinned piece. Here, if your opponent pins your knight first, trying to put a pressure on this square, because if you capture here, the queen recaptures it and knight can capture on the e4 square. That doesn't stop us. We are not bothered about it. We can simply play our knight to c3. If you capture it back with the pawn this time and not with the queen. Now, why with the pawn? You are actually having good controls in the diagonal. Look at this arrows that I'm drawing. The pieces are having such a good control all over the board. So basically, white is dominating the complete board. Even if you capture it with the pawn, the rook comes in the semi-open file and it is great. It is a very good position for white to play. Here, if he plays his knight to f6, we can go with a queen to a4, pinning the knight. The next idea is to play the pawn to d5 and take advantage of the pin. If here, he tries to defend the pin by playing his queen to d7, that is the only option there, then we can either play bishop b5, put some more pressure there. We can play our pawn to d5, trying to get rid of it. But the most interesting line here is to play the pawn to h4. Now, many times your opponent might get confused. Why have we played our pawn to h4? What is the idea? They might think, okay, it's just waste of move. And white doesn't have a good move to do and so is wasting move by playing the pawn to h4. But that's not true. If they ignore our threat and play something like, let's say, bishop e7 or anything else, your main idea behind pawn h4 was to play bishop h3 and get rid of that queen. The queen goes away and now you can play pawn d5 and you're winning the minor piece. If he ignores the threat in a way, not playing the bishop to e7, instead just doing the long castle, then he loses the queen on the spot. You play bishop h3 and you win the queen there. So this was all about the Ponziani trap. These are the most common variations. Now facing a higher level opponent, let's say an advanced level opponent, or what is the best response that the grandmasters do here, we are going to have a look at. So stay tuned till that time and I'll see you again for the best response what is there from the black side. Thank you.